James sat in his cramped airplane seat, absent-mindedly flipping through the in-flight magazine, barely registering the images of exotic destinations. His head rested against the cool window as he gazed out into the night sky. The plane hummed softly, its wings slicing through thick clouds. All seemed normal, until it didn't. The plane gave a sudden, jarring lurch. James felt a subtle shift in the cabin, as though the air itself had thickened. His stomach tightened as the pilot's voice came over the intercom, crackling and distorted, announcing an unexpected landing. "Technical issues," the pilot said, in a tone that was too calm, too practiced. But something about the name of the airport, it was unfamiliar, unsettling. James racked his brain, but it was nowhere on his mental map of cities or travel hubs. The name clung to him like a splinter in his mind, scratching at his growing unease. Glancing around, he expected the other passengers to react, to share in his confusion. But they didn't. They sat still, too still. Their faces were blank, staring ahead as if they had already resigned themselves to something he wasn't yet aware of. Through the small window, the stars vanished. The world outside was swallowed by a dense fog, thick and heavy, obscuring everything beyond a few meters. The plane began its descent, and through the bus, a faint glow appeared. A runway. But this wasn't like any runway James had seen. It was cracked and worn, with weeds sprouting through the broken asphalt. The lights lining the runway flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to dance just out of sight. As the plane touched down, the landing gear groaned under the weight, the sound echoing ominously in the otherwise dead silence. The usual clamor of passengers unbuckling, retrieving luggage, or chatting in hushed tones was absent. Instead, there was a suffocating quiet that pressed down on James's chest, making it hard to breathe. Peering out the window, he saw an airport terminal in the distance, barely illuminated by a few dying lights. The building looked abandoned, its glass windows dark and streaked with grime. There were no planes, no ground crew. The terminal stood like a tombstone, isolated in the fog. The plane came to a halt, but no one moved. James unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling slightly, as he looked around once more. The other passengers remained eerily still, their expressions vacant. A heavy silence filled the cabin, thick and oppressive. James's skin crawled. The sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his perception, was almost palpable. Compelled by an instinct he couldn't explain, James stood and made his way toward the exit. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the narrow aisle, the sound reverberating in the otherwise dead silence. No flight attendants greeted him as he reached the door. The typical chirp of airport announcements was conspicuously absent. He gripped the cold metal handle of the plane door. The moment he pushed it open, a gust of frigid air slapped his face, and the world outside seemed to exhale, an icy, desolate breath that carried the tang of salt and something else, something metallic. His heart pounded in his chest as he descended the steps, his shoes tapping lightly on the stairwell. The air was bitter, carrying with it a sense of decay, like the scent of rotting wood mixed with the stale breath of the ocean. The fog pressed in from all sides, limiting his vision to just a few feet in front of him. James glanced over his shoulder. The plane was still there, but the eerie stillness of it unnerved him. It felt like an empty shell, as if everything inside had withered away the moment he stepped out. He moved toward the terminal, each step feeling heavier than the last, his breath forming small clouds in the chilled air. The wind whispered faintly, twisting through the decayed buildings and fractured runway. It sounded almost like words, but too faint and distorted for him to make out. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, but whenever he turned, there was nothing there. The closer he got to the terminal, the stronger the feeling became. The sense that this place was wrong. There was no other word for it. It didn't just look abandoned, it felt abandoned. Time itself seemed to hang differently here, stretched thin, as if it had been forgotten for years, left to rot in the fog. James felt the weight of isolation settle on his shoulders. The wind grew colder, biting into his skin, and yet, even in the biting chill, a bead of sweat formed on his brow. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. The plane loomed behind him, but it felt like no refuge. In front of him, the terminal stood in eerie silence, its dark windows like eyes staring into his soul. As he approached the doors, his hand hesitated on the handle. The cold metal felt like ice against his skin. Something inside was watching him, waiting for him to enter. James knew this in the deepest part of himself, and yet he pushed the door open, stepping into the decaying terminal, unaware that his descent into the unknown had only just begun. James stepped into the terminal, the door creaking ominously as it swung shut behind him with a thud that reverberated through the empty space. He was immediately struck by the sheer sense of abandonment that clung to everything in sight. The terminal was vast, but not in the way airports normally felt. Here, the openness was hollow, like a graveyard for forgotten places. The walls were stained with years of neglect, yellowed with age. Faded advertisements hung crookedly from cracked pillars, their slogans barely legible beneath layers of dust and grime. Old wooden benches, cracked and splintered, lined the main hall, their surfaces scarred as if something had clawed at them, desperate to escape. He could feel the weight of time bearing down on the place, time that had long since passed but refused to leave. The air was stifling, a stagnant mix of mold and the unmistakable smell of something ancient and decomposing. With each step, James's shoes scuffed against the filthy tile floor, sending small clouds of dust swirling around his ankles. The sound of his footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, bouncing back at him from unseen corners, amplifying the eerie quiet that filled the space. It was as though the airport had been hastily abandoned and forgotten by the world. Baggage claim belts lay dormant, the machinery rusted and broken. The once bright signs announcing arrivals and departures were now dark, the glass enclosures smeared with dirt and grime, making them unreadable. As James wandered deeper into the terminal, he felt something change in the air. It wasn't just the stillness anymore. There was a presence, something intangible, watching him. The air thickened with a strange electricity, and every nerve in his body screamed for him to turn around, to leave this place before it consumed him. Then he saw them. At first, they were just shapes in the distance, faint and barely distinguishable through the dim light and foggy windows. They moved slowly, aimlessly, like shadows flitting at the edge of his vision. James squinted, his pulse quickening. As the shapes drew nearer, he realized they were people, or at least, they used to be. Ghostly figures began to emerge from the darkness, drifting slowly toward him. Their skin was ashen, their faces gaunt and hollow, eyes sunken deep into their skulls, lifeless and glassy. They were dressed in old-fashioned travel clothes, suits and dresses that looked like they belonged in another era, their fabric frayed and worn. Some clutched suitcases that had long since fallen apart, the leather cracked and peeling. Others dragged bags that looked too heavy for their withered arms to carry. James froze, his throat tightening as the figures approached. They moved without sound, their feet gliding across the floor, their movements unnatural, jerky, like puppets pulled by invisible strings. Their eyes, empty and cold, seemed to lock on to him, though their mouths never moved. Then one of them spoke. "Give us your seat." The voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. The passenger, a woman in her mid-30s with sunken eyes and pale skin, stood in front of James. Her clothes were tattered, hanging loosely from her frail frame. She extended a hand, bony fingers trembling. "Please, we need your seat," she rasped, her voice thick with desperation, though her lips barely moved. Her eyes bore into him with a terrifying intensity. James took a step back, heart pounding in his chest. What are you talking about?" he managed to choke out, though deep down, part of him already knew this was no ordinary request. More of the figures began to gather around him, their pale faces eerily blank, yet filled with a deep, insatiable yearning. They didn't speak, but the plea was the same. Each one, as they floated closer, reached out with their skeletal hands, murmuring the same chilling request. "Give up your seat." James's breath quickened. His instincts screamed for him to run, but something about their eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, held him in place. The desperation in their gaze gnawed at him, twisting his insides with fear. One of the figures, an older man in a tattered business suit, staggered closer, his fingers brushing against James's arm, sending a cold jolt through his body. James recoiled, pulling away, but the man's voice echoed through the desolate terminal. "We've been waiting so long, it's your turn." James stumbled backward, his feet catching on the uneven tiles as he tried to escape their reach. But no matter how fast he moved, the figures seemed to close in effortlessly, their pale, emotionless faces following his every movement. Panic surged through him. His mind raced, grasping for some explanation, some logic that could explain what was happening. But there was none. These weren't people. They were something else, trapped here, wandering in this abandoned place, forever waiting for something that would never come. Desperate to escape their grasp, James turned and bolted toward the exit. But as he reached the doors, his heart sank. The heavy fog outside had thickened, swirling like a living thing, obscuring the runway and the airplane beyond. He could no longer see the plane at all, only an impenetrable wall of mist stretching as far as the eye could see. The ghosts were following him now, their movements quickening, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. "Your seat, you must give it up." James shoved the door open, gasping as he stumbled out into the cold, biting wind. But the fog was everywhere, enveloping him, pressing in on all sides. The airport terminal behind him loomed in the mist, its windows dark, lifeless. The figures were still there, watching, waiting, their spectral forms barely visible through the swirling fog. There was no escape, not yet. The voices echoed around him, bouncing off the fog, filling the empty night air with their haunting demand. James turned back toward the terminal, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figures remained inside, drifting closer, their faces contorted in silent anguish. And then, through the fog, terrifying realization began to dawn on him. These weren't just ghosts, these were passengers, souls who had once been alive, who had boarded a flight just like his. Now they were trapped here, locked in this forsaken place, and they were looking for someone to take their place. James's breath was uneven as he stumbled back into the terminal, the fog swirling behind him like a thick curtain that threatened to consume everything. The spectral figures still lurked in the shadows, their presence more oppressive now, as if they could sense the growing panic within him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had seen, of the whispers that clung to the air around him. "Give up your seat." The words echoed in his head, but James forced them aside. He needed answers. He couldn't stay out in the fog, surrounded by those things. The terminal, though decayed and oppressive, was the only shelter. He had to go deeper. There had to be something, some clue as to what was happening. He wandered further into the bowels of the terminal, his footsteps echoing eerily down the long, empty hallways. The deeper he ventured, the more time seemed to unravel around him. The lights overhead flickered weakly, buzzing with a sickly hum that grated on his nerves. The walls were no longer just dirty, they seemed to be rotting, sagging inward, as if they could. James stood frozen in the middle of the decaying terminal, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. The horrifying reality of the situation sank in deeper with every minute. He was trapped. The weight of that thought grew heavier with each encounter, each spectral face pleading for a release they could never seem to grasp. His mind raced, the pieces of this grim puzzle falling into place. This wasn't just an abandoned airport. It was a limbo, a purgatory for the lost souls who had been lured here, just as he had been. They wanted something from him, his seat on the flight, his escape. But what escape was there? The plane he had arrived on had vanished into the fog, swallowed by the eerie mist. The terminal was a decaying labyrinth, and beyond it, the desolate runway stretched into oblivion. There was nowhere to go, except deeper. The cold air stung his lungs as he made his way through the endless corridors, turning corner after corner. The terminal was a maze of forgotten halls, old waiting rooms, and silent, lifeless gates, each one more decrepit than the last. Time seemed to warp in this place. He couldn't tell how long he had been walking. Hours? Days? The terminal itself felt like a void, bending reality, stretching moments into eternity. Then he found it, an old, forgotten section of the terminal, a wing that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. The walls were lined with rusting luggage carts and rotting benches, their cushions torn and sagging. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting a sickly yellow glow on everything. At the end of the corridor, James spotted something, A small office, its door ajar, light flickering from within. Compelled by some morbid curiosity, or perhaps desperation, he stepped inside. The room was cramped and cluttered, filled with stacks of old papers, flight manifests, and dust-covered binders. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the walls were lined with faded photographs of past passengers, their faces eerily frozen in time. On the desk, an old typewriter sat abandoned, its keys long rusted. But what caught James's eye was a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age and brittle to the touch. He picked one up and scanned the front page, his heart skipping a beat. Mystery Airport reappears after decades. Dozens lost, read the headline, accompanied by a grainy black and white photograph of the same terminal in which he now stood. The article detailed a string of mysterious disappearances over the years, each tied to this airport, which appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly, leaving behind no trace of the passengers or planes. The reports dated back to the 1950s and stretched into the early 2000s, each incident eerily similar: flights that diverted unexpectedly to this unknown airport, passengers who disembarked only to never be seen again. James's blood ran cold. He wasn't the first. Flipping through more articles, he saw the same story repeated again and again. Names of passengers who had boarded flights with no known destination. Their photographs showed smiling faces, some families, others businessmen, but all had one thing in common. They had vanished after arriving at this cursed place. Suddenly, his vision blurred, and the room seemed to twist around him. He staggered back, overwhelmed by a sickening sense of vertigo. Images flashed before his eyes, snapshots of other passengers, disoriented and afraid, just as he was, being led into the terminal, their faces frozen in terror as they realized what was happening. Then the whispers came again, louder this time. "Give us your seat." James whirled around. The ghosts were back, standing in the doorway of the office, dozens of them. Their hollow eyes bore into him, their lips moving silently, mouthing the same words over and over. They crowded into the small room, their cold, bony hands reaching for him and pulling him closer. "No!" James shouted, stumbling back against the desk, his mind screaming in panic. He pushed past them, their translucent fingers grazing his skin, sending chills through his body. He bolted out of the office and down the corridor, heart hammering in his chest. He ran until his legs burned, the terminal corridors stretching endlessly before him. But no matter how fast or far he fled, the ghosts followed. Their voices filled his ears, their plea growing more insistent, more desperate. "Give up your seat. Let us go." And then as he turned a corner, he saw it. The airplane, or at least what was left of it. The aircraft stood in the center of a long-forgotten terminal gate, its fuselage cracked and decayed, windows shattered, and metal rusted from years of neglect. The sight was like a slap to the face. This was the same plane that had brought him here, yet now it looked as though it had been abandoned for decades. The runway beyond it was barely visible through the fog, but the plane's engines were eerily humming, like it was still waiting for something. For him. James hesitated, his breath shallow and ragged. He glanced back at the ghosts that trailed him, faces pale and gaunt, their eyes filled with pleading sorrow. They stopped just short of the plane, hovering at the edge of the terminal, waiting for his decision. Then one of them stepped forward. A woman, her hair disheveled, her skin a sickly gray, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She looked at James with a sorrow so deep it felt like it would swallow him whole. "You can leave," she whispered, "but someone must stay." James's heart froze. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. The price, the ticket, his escape. The only way out was to give up his seat, to condemn someone else to this limbo in his place. He looked around desperately, but there was no one else. No passengers, no flight crew, no one but the dead, and him. The woman's voice echoed in his mind. "It's your turn now, just as we once had our turn." His legs trembled as he took a step toward the plane. The door was open, the aisle illuminated by dim overhead lights, flickering like a heartbeat. Inside, the seats were occupied by ghostly figures, passengers who had failed to escape. Their eyes followed him, lifeless and dull. One seat remained empty, his seat. James's mind raced. Could he really do it? Could he give up his seat and condemn another soul to this horror? He felt the icy touch of the ghosts around him, urging him forward. But with each step, the weight of the decision bore down on him harder, pressing into his chest like a vice. He reached the foot of the boarding stairs, his hand trembling, and he reached out to the railing. The door loomed above him, an open maw ready to swallow him whole. Then the voices whispered again. "Choose, give us your seat, or stay forever." James stood at the foot of the airplane's boarding stairs, his heart pounding as if it was trying to break free from his chest. The fog swirled around him, thick and suffocating, muffling all sound except for the eerie hum of the plane's engines. The door to the cabin yawned open like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. The air was heavy with an oppressive weight, thick with the expectations of the dead passengers who watched him from within the terminal and beyond. He had to make a choice. His mind reeled as the gravity of the situation pressed down on him. Escape meant condemning another soul to this eternal prison. If he gave up his seat, he would be free. But the cost, someone else would take his place. Was he really capable of doing that? Of damning another person to this ghostly purgatory just to save himself? His gaze flickered back to the figures that loomed in the shadows of the terminal. They stared at him with hollow, lifeless eyes, some pleading, others filled with quiet resignation. Each one had once been in his position. Each had faced this terrible choice. And now they were trapped, lost in this decaying limbo, unable to move on because someone else had taken their place. "Choose," a voice echoed from the plane, soft yet chilling, like the wind whispering through dead trees. Someone must stay. James's knees trembled as he ascended the stairs, his hand brushing the cold, rusted railing. The closer he got to the cabin, the more the oppressive weight of his decision bore down on him. He could almost feel the pull of the ghost behind him, their whispers swirling in his ears. "You must give us your seat." Inside the cabin, the air was stifling, thick with a sense of dread that clung to every corner. The seats were filled with ghostly passengers, each one locked in a silent, eternal flight. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes sunken and vacant, as if all the life had been drained from them. Every seat but one was occupied. The last, his seat, was waiting for him at the center of the cabin, the overhead light flickering weakly above it. James moved down the narrow aisle, his steps slow and hesitant. Each passenger turned to look at him as he passed, their eyes empty but full of expectation. He could feel their gaze burning into him, as if silently urging him to sit, to join them in their endless, nightmarish journey. He stopped at the empty seat, his breath shallow. The cold air inside the plane pressed down on him, and for a moment he wondered if this was it. Would he sit down, buckle in, and simply be carried off into oblivion like the others? Was there any escape from this? Then, as if in answer to his thoughts, a voice came from behind him. "You can leave, but there is a price." James turned, his body trembling. Standing at the entrance of the cabin was the woman he had seen earlier, the one who had pleaded with him to give up his seat. She looked even more ghastly up close, her pale skin stretched tightly over her skull, her hollow eyes fixed on him. Her lips barely moved as she spoke. "We all had our turn. We all boarded this flight thinking we could escape. But someone always has to stay behind. You can leave if you take the place of someone else." James's mind whirled. He could barely comprehend what she was saying. His throat tightened as panic surged within him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. If he wanted to leave, someone else had to take his place. Someone still alive. He stumbled backward, eyes wide, his back pressing against the cold, hard seat. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she were barely tethered to this reality. Her eyes never left his. "The others tried to escape too," she said, her voice barely more than a rasp. "But they stayed. Now it's your turn to decide. Will you leave, or will you stay like us?" James felt the weight of her words sink into him, the truth of this place finally clear. This airport, this cursed terminal, was a trap, a limbo for those who boarded flights that shouldn't exist, where no one ever truly leaves. Only transfers occur, one soul for another. He glanced at the open door of the airplane, where the fog still curled and swirled, blocking out any view of the outside world. Freedom was just a few steps away. He could run, flee from this nightmare, and escape into the unknown. But then his eyes flicked back to the ghosts, to the pleading faces staring at him from the cabin and the terminal. They were waiting for him to choose, waiting for someone to be condemned in his place. His mind screamed with indecision. He couldn't do it. Could he? Could he sacrifice someone else, some innocent soul, to escape this hell? Suddenly, the woman reached out, her cold fingers brushing against his arm, sending an icy jolt through his body. "You're running out of time," she whispered. "The flight doesn't wait." James jerked away from her, his pulse thundering in his ears. His heart was racing now, his body trembling with fear and panic. He knew what he had to do. But could he live with himself if he did? The plane's engines roared to life, louder now, vibrating through the entire cabin. The lights flickered violently, casting long shadows that twisted and danced across the walls. Time was running out. The door to the cabin began to close, slowly at first, but gaining speed. James had seconds to make his decision. In a blur of desperation, he bolted down the aisle, his feet slamming against the floor as he raced toward the exit. The ghosts reached out for him, their hands brushing against his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His mind was a whirlwind of terror and guilt as he lunged for the closing door. As he leaped through the gap, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. The fog swallowed him whole. The night was a tempestuous blend of calm and silence, the kind of storm that made the air tremble with tension. Lightning slashed through the sky, illuminating the rolling clouds that loomed over Atlantic Municipal Airport, casting eerie shadows over the runway. Tom Delaney, a young air traffic controller, settled into his cramped station high in the control tower, where the faint hum of machinery was interrupted only by the occasional crackle of static over the radio. The familiarity of his job soothed him. He had spent countless hours watching planes take off and land, a ballet of metal and sky that felt as natural as breathing. But tonight was different. As the winds howled, rattling the glass windows, Tom felt a creeping unease wash over him. The storm was fierce, its fury palpable, and a sense of foreboding hung heavy in the air. He glanced out into the rain-slicked darkness, the lights of the runway barely penetrating the sheets of water that cascaded from the sky. It was the kind of night when shadows seemed to stretch and twist into unrecognizable shapes, and the familiar sounds of the airport were drowned out by the relentless roar of thunder. Then, in the midst of the chaos, a blip flickered onto his radar screen, its presence an anomaly in the stormy chaos. Tom leaned closer, his heart quickening as he saw the small, private plane struggling against the storm, its call sign unfamiliar. His fingers danced over the controls as he initiated contact, his voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Atlantic Control to private aircraft, please identify." The response that came was garbled and distorted, as if the very essence of the plane's existence was battling against the storm. "Atlantic Control, we're emergency landing." The voice was cold and mechanical, sending a shiver up Tom's spine. Something was wrong, the words slurred together, filled with an urgency that was chilling. "Roger that, I've got you on radar," he replied, trying to inject calm into the chaos. "Turn to heading 230 and prepare for landing." As he spoke, he noticed the plane's altitude dropping on his radar, but his gaze shifted to the windows in a desperate hope to catch a glimpse of the aircraft through the torrential rain. Yet outside, nothing but darkness awaited. No blinking lights, no outline of the aircraft. Just the relentless downpour, thickening the air with a sense of dread. "Help us! Please! It's too dark!" The voice on the radio returned, sounding increasingly desperate, almost panicked. Each word seemed to crackle with static, like an echo of some long-forgotten scream. It was as if he could feel the terror radiating from the other side of the line, chilling him to the bone. "Where are you?" Tom urged, his voice strained, battling the growing fear. "I don't see you on the runway." The response came again, this time layered with an unsettling distortion. "We can't leave." Tom's heart raced as he glanced back at the radar. The plane hovered just above the tarmac, the instruments unwavering in their assertion of its presence, yet his eyes found only darkness outside the tower. The unsettling feeling that something unnatural was at play settled like ice in his stomach. Then, as suddenly as it began, the radar screen went blank. The once familiar hum of the equipment turned to an ominous silence. The voice disappeared into static, leaving Tom alone in the dark, his heart pounding in the suffocating quiet. He spent the next several hours frantically searching the radar, rechecking his systems and scanning the skies, but to no avail. The private plane was nowhere to be found. In the morning, he would file a report, but tonight he was left with the growing certainty that something was deeply wrong. The storm finally abated, but it left in its wake a lingering dread. As Tom sat in the control tower, the fading echoes of the chilling voice lingered in his mind, and he realized that the night had stripped away his beliefs, unveiling a terrifying truth. Some things defy logic, existing in the shadows between the worlds we know. The days following the stormy night were clouded with an eerie sense of disconnection. Tom Delaney returned to his routine as an air traffic controller, but the confidence that once anchored him began to waver. Each time he settled into his station, the oppressive memory of that night loomed over him like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. The radar flickered before him, a glowing reminder of the plane that had vanished without a trace. As he conducted his duties, the skies above felt tainted, and Tom was haunted by the mechanical voice still echoing in his mind. Every crackle of the radio sent a shiver down his spine, and he could almost hear it again. "Help us. Please, it's too dark." He began to wonder if he was losing his grip on reality, the boundaries between sanity and madness blurring like the rain-soaked horizon outside. The nights became increasingly difficult. While the airport settled into its usual routine, Tom found himself staring at the radar screen for hours, waiting for the familiar hum of planes taking off and landing. But instead of comfort, he felt an insatiable dread build inside him. Each flash of static made his pulse race. Each fleeting whisper felt like a caress of something otherworldly creeping into his life. It wasn't long before the calls began again. Late at night, when the airport was shrouded in darkness and the world outside was asleep, the static would return. At first, it was a mere annoyance, a crackle in the air. But then the voices came, faint and indistinct. They coiled through the radio like smoke, wrapping around him, and he found himself straining to understand what they were saying. They were always the same, overlapping, desperate, and unnervingly familiar. "Tom, help us. Can't find. Too dark." The pleas were both haunting and chilling, each word a shard of glass piercing the veil of his rational mind. Tom tried to convince himself it was merely the stress, the long hours, the exhaustion, but deep down he knew something unnatural was at play. Determined to uncover the truth, he began poring over the records and archives of the airport. He spent countless hours in the musty storage room, sifting through yellowed papers, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the anomaly. His fingers trembled as he flipped through incident reports, flight logs, and historical records, each page turning like the ticking clock in his mind. Then, amidst the sea of mundane paperwork, he discovered a peculiar entry that made his heart race. A report from the 1950s detailing a small private plane that had disappeared during a storm, eerily similar to the one he had encountered. The report noted the last transmission, a desperate call for help, eerily similar to the voice that had haunted him. "We can't find the light. It's too dark." A chill coursed through him, and he felt the cold fingers of fear wrapping around his throat. Tom's mind raced with the implications. The voice he had heard on the radio was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, sinister narrative woven into the very fabric of the airport. Despite the dread settling in his stomach, Tom's curiosity drove him deeper into the archives. He learned that the families of the missing passengers had long since given up hope, their lives marred by the tragedy, haunted by unanswered questions. Rumors of the supernatural circulated among the airport staff, stories of eerie calls and phantom planes that slipped through the cracks of reality, but they had never reached Tom until now. In his obsession, he sought out those families, hoping to find solace or a shred of understanding. He discovered that many refused to speak about the tragedy, claiming it had cursed their lives, turning them into shadows of their former selves. The fear in their eyes spoke volumes, a silent agreement to leave the past buried. One night, alone in the tower, Tom decided to test the waters. He switched on the radio, bracing himself for the static, half expecting the disembodied voice to return. And it did, like a dark echo from the abyss. "Help us. Please, too dark." This time, the voice was joined by others, more voices, layered and frantic, each syllable dripping with a chilling desperation. They called out to him, weaving a tapestry of fear and longing, pushing him closer to the edge of his sanity. He could no longer separate his reality from the growing madness around him. Shadows danced at the corners of his vision, whispers slithered through the air, and he began to feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. That night, as he prepared to leave the tower, the temperature suddenly dropped, making his breath visible in the cold air. He felt a strange presence behind him, as though the very walls of the control tower were closing in, suffocating him in their grip. Turning, he saw nothing but darkness, yet he felt a heavy pressure, like the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down on him. And then the radio crackled again, its voice like ice water pouring into his veins. "You let us die. Now you will join us." As the shadows deepened around him, Tom realized with horrifying clarity that the unseen passengers were no longer just trapped in the past. They were reaching out, ensnaring him in their torment. He had unwittingly crossed a line, and the whispers of the lost were no longer mere echoes. They were a sinister invitation to share in their eternal despair. Tom Delaney was consumed by the dread that had nestled deep within him. The desperate voices on the radio were no longer just echoes of the past. They had transformed into a sinister presence that shadowed his every move. As he navigated the daily operations of the airport, the weight of the supernatural burden pressed heavily on his mind. Every beep of the radar felt like a taunt, reminding him of the plane that had vanished and the souls forever trapped in that night's storm. Driven by obsession, Tom dove headfirst into the archives of Atlantic Municipal Airport, scouring through reports and documents with feverish urgency. The fading ink of history felt alive beneath his fingertips, each record pulsating with the energy of untold stories and unresolved tragedies. The clock on the wall ticked like a metronome of his unraveling sanity, echoing louder as he pieced together the fragmented narratives of those who had come before him. The more he searched, the more he felt an invisible thread binding him to the mysterious plane that had disappeared. Each name he encountered, each family left shattered by the loss, felt like a spectral touch against his soul, tugging him deeper into the abyss of their grief. The 1950s report had been just the beginning. Tom uncovered a series of chilling accounts, similar incidents occurring in the years that followed, each one punctuated by unsettling whispers on the radio, all leading back to that same fateful storm. Days blurred into nights as he immersed himself in the harrowing details. He learned that the small private plane, the Bellevue Star, had been carrying a family of 4 and a pilot when it vanished. The report detailed the final transmission. "Mayday! We can't find the light. It's too dark." Those words sent shivers racing down Tom's spine, a chilling refrain that mirrored the voices haunting him now. As he delved deeper, he unearthed a series of similar incidents, lost flights and ghostly transmissions from decades past. It was as if a malign presence had woven itself into the very fabric of the airport, an unseen hand pulling the strings of fate, ensuring that the echoes of despair never faded. Tom felt the threads tightening around him, ensnaring him in their ghostly embrace. One evening, while sifting through a particularly dusty file, Tom stumbled upon a photograph of the Bellevue Star, its shiny exterior gleaming against a bright blue sky, frozen in a moment of joy before its fate was sealed. A wave of nausea washed over him as he recognized the faces of the passengers, smiling, carefree, blissfully unaware of the doom that awaited them. Their eyes, however, seemed to hold a deep sadness that belied their joy, as if they had known even then that they were stepping into a dark abyss. Unable to shake the feeling of impending doom, Tom decided to reach out to the families of the victims. With each phone call, he felt the weight of his purpose. He was a harbinger of truth, a messenger to those who had long buried their pain. Yet the responses he received were far from what he had hoped. The families he contacted were shrouded in fear, their voices trembling as they recounted their stories. They spoke of shadows lurking at the edges of their lives, of strange occurrences and whispered warnings that had haunted them since the tragedy. "You should leave it alone," one woman pleaded, her voice thick with sorrow. "It's better not to know. The dead don't rest easy. They want something." But Tom's curiosity drove him further. He felt an unyielding need to understand the connection between the lost flight and his own torment. That night, the radio crackled to life once more, but this time it brought a revelation that paralyzed him with fear. "Tom, you let us die," came the chilling voice, more insistent, almost accusatory. "Now you will join us." It was a command, an invitation laced with malice. The walls of the control tower felt as if they were closing in on him, and Tom realized he was being drawn into a vortex of despair that threatened to consume him whole. His breath quickened, panic clawing at his throat, but something deep within him also felt a strange thrill, a dark allure that beckoned him closer to the truth. As he prepared to leave the tower that night, he felt an inexplicable urge to return to the runway, to stand where the plane had supposedly landed. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, he stepped outside into the oppressive darkness. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of wet asphalt clung to him, and the faint flicker of the runway lights painted ghostly shadows across the ground. In the distance, he could hear the echoes of distant thunder, a low rumble that seemed to resonate with the unease festering in his heart. The wind rustled through the trees, whispering secrets he could not decipher. As he approached the runway, Tom felt an electric charge in the air, a sense of anticipation, as if the very ground beneath him thrummed with life. And then he heard it, the familiar static of the radio, distant yet undeniable, drawing him in. "Tom, too dark. Help us." The voice, once merely an eerie whisper, now seemed to envelop him, wrapping around him like a shroud. He could feel the air grow heavy, filled with a tangible sense of dread. His heart raced as he fumbled for his radio, desperately attempting to reach out, to make contact. But the connection had shifted. It was no longer a mere plea. It had morphed into a ritualistic chant, a call from the abyss. Suddenly, the atmosphere thickened, and a figure appeared at the edge of his vision, a fleeting glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there. Was it a trick of the light, or had he really seen a silhouette standing in the shadows, watching him? A chill raced down his spine, and he stumbled back, his mind reeling with the impossibility of it all. The night was alive with the weight of the lost, and Tom understood with horrifying clarity that he was caught in a web spun from despair and darkness. He had opened a door that could never be closed, and the restless souls of the Bellevue Star were waiting for him, longing for release. The shadows danced, beckoning him to join their eternal flight, and as the whispers swelled around him, he realized he was no longer in control. He was merely a pawn in a game that stretched far beyond his comprehension. The following days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and disorienting whispers. Tom Delaney found himself increasingly isolated, the world outside the control tower fading into a mere backdrop to the chaos brewing within him. The voices had become an almost constant presence, rising and falling like the tide, lapping at the shores of his sanity. Each time he settled into his station, the radio crackled with a life of its own, as if it were a conduit connecting him to the spectral realm he had unwittingly trespassed upon. Tom could no longer dismiss the encounters he had experienced. The shadows he glimpsed at the edges of his vision morphed into ghostly silhouettes that seemed to taunt him, drawing nearer with each passing night. And those fleeting images of the Bellevue Star passengers haunted his dreams, their eyes filled with sorrow, their voices echoing his name, urging him to uncover the truth. He became consumed by a singular obsession: to confront the history of the airport and to break the cycle that tethered the lost souls to their torment. That night, he decided to return to the archives one final time, hoping to find a clue that might illuminate the path forward. As he sifted through old documents, the stale air around him seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. His heart raced as he unearthed another file, a record of an old ritual that had taken place at the airport in the early years of its operation. The locals had spoken in hushed tones of a sacred ceremony performed to appease the spirits of the lost. Those who had dared to disturb their slumber had faced dire consequences, their lives forever altered by the unearthly forces they had provoked. The implications hit him like a sledgehammer. The accident with the Bellevue Star had merely been the culmination of decades of unrest, a catastrophic finale to a story woven with grief and tragedy. Tom's determination grew stronger as he realized that the key to freeing the souls lay in acknowledging the past. He gathered the documents in a frenzy, clutching them as if they were the last thread connecting him to reality. As he stepped back into the control tower, he felt an otherworldly presence coiling around him, whispering secrets he was desperate to understand. That night, a storm unlike any he had ever experienced rolled into the area, dark clouds roiling above like a living entity. The wind howled through the control tower, rattling the windows and sending shivers down his spine. It was as if the very air was charged with anticipation, crackling with energy, as though the universe was responding to the turmoil within him. With the tempest raging outside, Tom felt an irresistible pull to the runway where the Bellevue star had vanished. He knew he had to confront the source of the whispers, to face the ghosts that lingered in the shadows. Heart pounding, he stepped outside, the rain pelting down in sheets, drenching him instantly. The runway stretched out before him, a slick ribbon of darkness illuminated by the sporadic flashes of lightning. As he made his way toward the tarmac, he felt the atmosphere shift, a palpable tension in the air. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that swirled around him, tugging at his consciousness. Help us. Let us go. Find the light. The chorus of pleas reverberated through the storm, a haunting lament that echoed through the rain-soaked night. Tom reached the spot where the Bellevue star had last been seen. He could feel the weight of the lost passengers pressing in around him, the shadows coalescing into shapes that danced just beyond his sight. Panic surged within him, but he steadied himself, remembering the ritual he had uncovered. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath as he steadied his shaking hands. He began to recite the words he had learned, feeling the energy of the storm surrounding him, blending with the desperate pleas that echoed in the night. As he spoke, a strange calm washed over him. The voices grew quiet, and for the first time, he felt a connection to the restless spirits, as if they were listening, yearning for release. But just as he began to feel a sense of hope, the storm intensified, whipping the rain into a frenzy, drowning out his voice. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the runway with an otherworldly glow. Tom was suddenly struck by a vision, a flash of the Bellevue star, its passengers desperately trying to escape, trapped in the storm that had claimed them. He could see their faces, twisted in fear, and hear their cries echoing through the storm. In that moment, he understood the nature of their plight. They were not just lost souls. They were anchored to the airport by a shared trauma, a collective despair that demanded recognition. Tom realized he could not free them alone. He needed to summon the strength of the living, to bring the memories of the lost to light. As the storm raged, he fell to his knees on the slick tarmac, crying out for the families of the victims. You have to remember them. They need you to remember. Help me help them. The winds howled in response and the rain lashed down harder, drowning out his voice. But he could feel a shift in the atmosphere, a ripple of energy that surged around him, as if the storm itself were awakening to his call. With every word, he drew upon the memories of those who had perished, conjuring their stories, their laughter, their love, and their loss. And then a flash of light illuminated the night. Tom's heart raced as he witnessed a ghostly figure emerging from the shadows, a young girl with tear-streaked cheeks standing before him. She held out her hand, reaching for him, her voice a mere whisper in the storm. Help us find our way home. Tom extended his hand, and in that moment, he felt the weight of the lost soul pressing in around him, merging their sorrow with his own. As the wind howled and the rain poured, he understood that they were not alone. He was their bridge to the living, their voice in the darkness. But the storm was not finished with him yet. As he reached out, the figure began to fade, the light surrounding her flickering like a candle in the wind. He grasped her hand, feeling a surge of energy that threatened to overwhelm him. I won't let you go, he shouted, desperation clawing at his throat. You are not forgotten. In a deafening roar, the storm reached its peak, the world around him transforming into a cacophony of sound and fury. The sky split open with a flash of light, and in that moment of chaos, he saw the runway fill with ghostly figures, passengers from the Bellevue star, their faces twisted with longing, their eyes wide with the need for release. The air crackled with electricity, and Tom understood that this was the moment of reckoning. He had summoned them, called them forth from the depths of despair, and now it was time for them to confront their past, to step into the light. But the storm continued to rage, a primal force of nature that threatened to tear them apart. And as the figures swirled around him, Tom felt a sudden jolt of fear, realizing that he too could be swept away into the darkness if he did not act quickly. With the storm at its height, he began to chant once more, pouring every ounce of his will into the words of the ritual. "You are not lost. You are not forgotten. Find the light." The voices of the dead surged around him, intertwining with the howling winds as they reached for the light that beckoned from beyond. In that climactic moment, everything converged. The storm, the whispers, the light. He saw the faces of the lost, heard their cries, felt their despair blending with his own. And as the world around him erupted into chaos, he knew that he had become their conduit, a bridge between the realms of the living and the dead. In the eye of the storm, he found himself at the center of it all, the swirling energies of both worlds colliding in a dance of light and shadow. He could feel the warmth of their gratitude mingling with the cold of their sorrow, and he understood that he had opened the door to the past. But would it be enough to free them? Would they finally find their way home? Or would he be forever ensnared in the darkness of their torment? As the storm raged on, Tom felt the weight of their souls around him, the cries of the lost reaching a fever pitch. It was a reckoning, a moment that would determine their fate and his own. The chaos of the storm swirled around Tom Delaney as he stood on the runway, the cacophony of desperate cries and thunderous roars merging into a singular, overwhelming entity. He felt himself suspended between two worlds, the air thick with an electric charge that crackled with the anguish of the lost souls surrounding him. The faces of the passengers from the Bellevue Star surged into his mind, their eyes wide with longing and despair, a chorus of yearning reaching out to him. "Find the light! Find the light!" he shouted against the howling wind, desperation flooding his voice as he felt their pain wrapping around him like a vice. He realized that the storm was not just a backdrop, it was a manifestation of their anguish, the embodiment of the chaos that had consumed them. This was the moment that would either seal their fate or offer them the freedom they so desperately sought. As he chanted the words of the ancient ritual, Tom envisioned the light that would guide the lost souls home. He saw it flickering in his mind, a warm beacon piercing through the tempest, offering hope amid the turmoil. He focused all his energy, pouring his will into the invocation, his heart racing with the urgency of the task at hand. The winds intensified, swirling with an almost sentient force, as if the storm were reacting to his plea. "You are not lost," he cried out, voice hoarse with emotion. "You have not been forgotten. Remember who you are. Remember the light." Each word echoed through the darkness, amplified by the storm, a testament to his determination to break the cycle of despair. Suddenly, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the night, revealing the full assembly of ghostly figures swirling around him, their forms shimmering like smoke against the backdrop of the storm. Tom could see their faces clearly now, anguish and hope intertwined, tears of longing streaming down their cheeks. They were drawn to his voice, their sorrow mingling with the tempest, urging him to lead them toward the light. In that moment, a powerful wave of emotion surged through him, a deep connection to the souls he had come to understand. They were not just victims of an accident, they were a family bound by love and loss, caught in the web of an unspeakable tragedy. With renewed determination, he summoned every ounce of strength he had left. "Let go of the darkness! Embrace the light!" His voice rang out, imbued with a fierce conviction that resonated through the storm. As he spoke, he felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden stillness amid the chaos. The wind seemed to calm, as if the very universe was listening to his call, responding to the yearning of the lost souls. In that fragile silence, Tom could hear a distant hum, a soft glow beginning to emerge from the heart of the storm. It pulsed like a heartbeat, radiating warmth and comfort, beckoning to the souls who had been trapped for far too long. "Follow me, it's time to go home," he urged, reaching out his hand toward the light. As if in response to his words, the ghostly figures began to coalesce, moving toward the warmth that shimmered in the air. He could feel the weight of their sorrow lift, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief and peace. The storm that had once been a prison now transformed into a passageway, guiding them toward their salvation. But just as hope began to blossom, A deafening roar erupted from the skies, a cacophony of anger and desperation. The storm surged back to life, furious and wild, the forces of nature battling against the bonds of the past. Tom staggered, feeling the energy shift once more, a chilling reminder that not all spirits were ready to embrace the light. "You cannot take them! They are ours!" a voice bellowed from the depths of the storm, dark and malevolent, echoing with the power of the lost and forgotten. The shadows around Tom thickened, clawing at him, as if attempting to drag him down into the abyss with them. He fought against the darkness, holding fast to the light that shimmered ahead. "You will not claim them!" he shouted, his voice rising above the din, filled with defiance. "They deserve to be free. Let them go." In that moment of confrontation, he felt an immense surge of energy coursing through him, a fierce determination igniting within his soul. He could not allow the darkness to claim the lives of the innocent. With every ounce of strength, he amplified the light, casting it forth like a beacon in the night. "Light, come forth!" he cried, and the glow intensified, illuminating the storm around him. It pulsed with life, vibrant and undeniable, banishing the shadows that sought to pull him under. The spirits responded to the light, drawn toward it with an urgency that filled him with hope. The ground trembled beneath him as the storm raged, the dichotomy of light and darkness colliding in a furious battle. Tom felt the warmth of the spirits surrounding him, their gratitude wrapping around him like a protective shield. They began to rise, their forms dissolving into brilliant specks of light that floated toward the shimmering glow ahead. "Together," he shouted, his voice melding with theirs, urging them to unite. "Together we will find our way home." As the last remnants of the storm surged around him, Tom closed his eyes, surrendering to the moment. He felt the energy of the lost souls melding with his own, their stories intertwining, creating a tapestry of love and loss. In that profound connection, he understood that they were not merely spirits. They were a part of him, woven into the very fabric of his being. With one final push, the light burst forth, enveloping him and the lost souls in a radiant embrace. The storm exploded into a brilliant display of energy, a clash of darkness and light that lit up the night sky. And then, in a flash, everything went still. When Tom opened his eyes, he found himself alone on the runway. The storm dissipated, leaving only a soft glow of dawn creeping over the horizon. The world felt different, quieter, more peaceful. He stood in awe, the weight of what had just transpired settling around him like a comforting blanket. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the remnants of the storm clouds, Tom felt a deep sense of calm wash over him. The air was crisp, and for the first time in years, he felt free. The ghosts that had haunted him were gone, their stories finally told, their souls released into the light. But as he turned to leave, he glanced back at the runway, and a gentle breeze swept through the air, carrying with it a whisper of gratitude. "Thank you," it seemed to say, a soft murmur that wrapped around him, bringing with it the warmth of love and peace. Tom walked away from the runway, a renewed sense of purpose guiding him. He had faced the darkness, and in doing so, he had become a guardian of the stories of the lost, a protector of their memories. The shadows that had once gripped him were now a part of the past, and with the dawn of a new day, he stepped into the light, ready to share the truth of what he had encountered and to ensure that the lost would never be forgotten again. The bustling airport had always been a comforting place for Nathan, filled with the excitement of travelers embarking on new adventures. He stepped into the terminal, the usual hum of conversations and rolling suitcases creating a vibrant atmosphere. But tonight was different. The dark clouds gathered ominously outside, and a sudden storm rolled in, slamming against the glass walls like a feral beast desperate to break free. As Nathan checked the departure board, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The blinking red lights signaled cancellations, one after another, like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Last call for Flight 763 has been canceled due to severe weather conditions," the announcement echoed, and an unsettling silence fell over the terminal. Travelers rushed toward the exits, their faces painted with confusion and frustration, leaving Nathan behind in an increasingly desolate space. He glanced around, noticing how quickly the bustling terminal transformed into an eerie shell. The once vibrant shops closed their shutters, and the seating areas that had been filled with families and friends were now haunted by shadows. Nathan walked through the empty rows, the clatter of his suitcase wheels sounding far too loud against the quiet. Each step reverberated, bouncing off the sterile tiles and high ceilings, amplifying the unsettling stillness. As he searched for a place to rest, the lights above flickered sporadically, bathing the terminal in a ghostly glow. The flickering cast strange shadows that darted across the walls like phantoms, leaving Nathan with an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. He could almost swear he saw movement in the corners of his vision, but each time he turned to look, there was nothing. Nothing, just emptiness. Then came the whispers. They began as soft murmurs, barely audible above the distant rumble of thunder outside. Nathan shook his head, trying to convince himself it was just the wind. But as the storm intensified, the whispers grew louder, weaving through the air like a chilling lullaby. "Help us! Find us!" They seemed to beckon, echoing off the walls, reverberating within his mind. Nathan's heart raced, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He quickened his pace, seeking solace in the bright terminal lights. But the shadows followed, growing denser and more oppressive. With each step, the feeling of isolation enveloped him, as if he had crossed an unseen threshold into a realm where reality twisted into something sinister. Desperate for a connection, he approached a nearby seating area, but the chairs were cold and unwelcoming, like sentinels guarding forgotten dreams. As he glanced around, he noticed the departure screen blinking ominously, displaying flight numbers that seemed to change before his eyes. What time was it? He couldn't tell, as the clock above appeared frozen, its hands stuck at 10 minutes to midnight. With a heavy sigh, Nathan leaned back against the plastic seat, trying to ignore the growing dread that curled around him like smoke. He wished for a moment that he could close his eyes and escape into sleep, but the whispers intensified, filling the air with an urgency that felt inescapable. "Don't sleep. Don't let the dark take you." With a final shuddering breath, Nathan realized he was not merely stranded by a storm. He was ensnared by something far more ominous that lurked within the shadows of the terminal, waiting for him to let his guard down. The shadows of the terminal stretched and twisted, morphing into grotesque shapes that flickered in the corners of Nathan's vision. Heart pounding, he pushed himself to rise from the cold plastic seat, feeling as if the very air was conspiring against him. He scanned the terminal, searching for anything familiar, a friendly face, a semblance of normalcy, but all he found was the oppressive silence, now thick with foreboding. As Nathan wandered further into the labyrinthine terminal, he heard the heavy thrum of rain pounding against the windows. The world outside had become a tempest, but inside an unsettling calm reigned. Just then he caught sight of the figure, a man dressed in a tattered airline uniform standing by the check-in counter. The uniform was frayed, its colors faded, giving him an otherworldly appearance, as if he belonged to a different era. "Hey, you," the figure called out, his voice gravelly and hollow, echoing unnaturally against the terminal walls. "Come here. I've been waiting for you." Nathan hesitated, his instincts screaming for him to run, yet something drew him closer, an invisible tether that seemed to pull him into the shadowy depths of the terminal. The man's face remained obscured under the brim of his battered cap, but the feeling of familiarity was unsettling. How could he know I've been waiting, Nathan thought, unease creeping up his spine. "Why are you waiting for me?" Nathan asked, his voice a shaky whisper as he approached. "Because you're lost," the figure replied, stepping closer. "Just like the rest of them." He gestured with a gnarled finger toward the darkened corners of the terminal. The air grew colder, and Nathan shivered as if the shadows themselves were breathing down his neck. Compelled, Nathan followed the figure as he slipped through a doorway marked "Staff Only." The hallway beyond was dimly lit, the flickering fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow on the peeling walls. A musty scent filled the air, tinged with the faintest hint of decay. As Nathan moved deeper into the corridor, the oppressive weight of the shadows began to close in around him. "Where are we going?" Nathan asked, trying to steady his racing heart. "To the lost," the figure replied, his voice growing quieter as they walked. "The ones who never made it out." Nathan glanced around, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, and he could swear he felt a chill touch on his skin, like icy fingers trailing along his spine. The walls were lined with old posters of flights long forgotten, their images faded and peeling. Then he saw them. Piles of abandoned luggage stacked against the walls, each suitcase holding secrets of its own. Some were cracked open, their contents spilling out like discarded dreams. Children's toys, a wedding dress crumpled and stained, photographs capturing moments of joy and laughter frozen in time. It felt like walking through a graveyard of hopes. "Why are these here?" Nathan asked, fear lacing his voice. "They were left behind," the figure said, his tone laced with a haunting sadness. "The ones who didn't make it, they were lost to the storm, just like you are now." As he stood there, Nathan felt a wave of despair wash over him. The whispers that had been swirling around him intensified, echoing in a haunting chorus. "Help us. Find us. We're still here." They filled his mind, rising like a crescendo, tugging at the strings of his heart. Suddenly, he noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Silhouettes flickered in and out of existence, vague shapes of people, their faces contorted in expressions of sorrow and longing. They reached out toward him, their mouths opening in silent pleas. Nathan staggered backward, his breath quickening. "Please, no," he stammered, fear gripping him tightly. He could feel their despair wash over him like a tidal wave, threatening to pull him into their abyss. "Embrace them," the figure urged, his voice echoing as the shadows thickened. "You must confront the truth. Acknowledge their pain. Only then can you find your way back." With dread pooling in his gut, Nathan realized the enormity of the task ahead. He had stumbled into a realm where time lost its meaning, where lost souls lingered in a state of torment. As the whispers continued to swirl around him, he felt the weight of their grief pressing down like an invisible shroud. The air was heavy with the scent of despair, and as Nathan took a deep breath, he could feel the fabric of reality fraying at the edges. He understood now. He was not just lost in an airport. He was in a place where the boundaries between life and death blurred, and he needed to find a way to bridge that chasm, or risk becoming another lost soul in the terminal's eternal nightmare. Nathan stood frozen in the dim corridor, the weight of despair pressing heavily on his chest as the whispers of the lost souls swirled around him. Their haunting cries echoed in his mind, and he felt the cold tendrils of fear gripping his heart. "Help us. Find us." They reached out from the shadows, and he could almost feel their icy fingers brushing against his skin, urging him to acknowledge their presence. "Why are you trapped here?" Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, torn between fear and an overwhelming sense of empathy. "What happened to you?" As if in response, the shadows began to coalesce into a more tangible form. Faces emerged from the darkness, their features twisted with anguish and longing. He saw a young woman, her eyes wide with terror. A man in a business suit, clutching a briefcase as if it were a lifeline. A child with a teddy bear, tears streaming down their ghostly cheeks. Each soul seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow, flickering in and out of existence like dying stars. "They were lost to the storm," the figure in the tattered uniform whispered, stepping closer to Nathan. "Trapped in the moments before their flights. They linger here, caught between worlds, unable to move on." Suddenly, the corridor shifted, warping around him. Nathan felt as if he were being drawn into the memories of these souls. The atmosphere thickened, and he was enveloped in a surreal haze. He could hear snippets of conversations. Laughter, excitement, the sounds of families saying their goodbyes. It was as if the very fabric of time had unraveled, allowing him a glimpse into the past. In one haunting vision, he saw the young woman standing at a check-in desk, her face bright with anticipation as she waved goodbye to her family. Then, without warning, the scene darkened, and he felt the suffocating grip of panic as the thunderstorm raged outside. The lights flickered violently, and he could hear the distant sound of an announcement, one that seemed to echo through the ages. "Attention, please. Due to unforeseen circumstances, all flights are delayed." In another vision, the businessman paced nervously, glancing at his watch as if time were slipping away. Nathan felt the anxiety wash over him, the sense of impending doom that had gripped the man's heart. Suddenly, the scene changed, and Nathan watched helplessly as the businessman was swallowed by shadows, his figure fading into the abyss. "I need to get home," the man had pleaded, but his voice was lost to the swirling chaos. The child with the teddy bear was next, a vision of innocence lost in the whirlwind of the storm. Nathan watched in horror as the little one called out for their mother, the sound echoing into the void. The shadows swarmed around the child, and Nathan's heart ached as he realized they were never coming back. "Mommy, where are you?" Their tiny voice pierced through the silence, a chilling reminder of the fragility of life. With each scene, Nathan felt his own fears rising to the surface. His regrets, his isolation, the choices he had made that had brought him to this moment. It was as if the airport had become a living entity, feeding off the despair of its lost souls, and he was inextricably bound to their fate. "Enough!" he shouted, breaking free from the visions. "I can't watch this anymore." The figure in the tattered uniform regarded him with a solemn expression. "You must confront their pain," he urged, his voice steady and calm amidst the chaos. "Acknowledge their stories, only then can you begin to understand the truth of this place." With determination surging through him, Nathan took a step closer to the shadows. He forced himself to face the sorrowful faces before him, no longer merely observers, but participants in their haunting narrative. "I see you," he said, his voice trembling, but resolute. "I know you're here. You're not forgotten." The atmosphere shifted, the oppressive weight of despair lifting just slightly as the spirits began to gather around him. Their whispers softened, transforming from mournful cries into a gentle chorus of understanding. "Remember us," they urged, their voices harmonizing in a bittersweet melody. "We are still here. Help us find peace." As Nathan focused on their pain, a deep sense of empathy filled him. He recognized their fears and regrets as reflections of his own life. Lost opportunities, unresolved relationships, the nagging sense of not having enough time. The more he connected with their stories, the more he felt the darkness recede, a light breaking through the heavy clouds of despair. But just as hope began to blossom, Nathan noticed something unsettling in the shadows, a flicker of movement that sent a chill racing down his spine. The whispers turned urgent, warning him of a new presence lurking in the darkness. The figure in the tattered uniform stepped back, eyes wide with caution. "It's not over yet," he warned. "There are darker things that dwell here, waiting for the unsuspecting." Nathan's heart raced as he spun around, eyes wide, searching the shadows for the source of the growing unease. The whispers shifted from sorrowful to frantic, a cacophony of warnings mingling with the sound of the storm raging outside. He realized the terminal was not just a place of lost souls. It was also a hunting ground for something far more sinister, something that thrived on the fear and despair of those trapped within its walls. The shadows around Nathan thickened, pulsating with a dark energy that crackled in the air like static electricity. Whispers morphed into frantic cries, echoing through the terminal as if the very walls were alive, absorbing the collective despair. The figure in the tattered uniform stepped back, his expression shifting from solemnity to urgency. "You must act quickly, Nathan. They are drawn to fear, and they sense your vulnerability." Nathan's heart raced, a primal instinct for survival flooding his veins. He felt the shadows coiling around him, creeping closer, feeding off the anxiety that had surged within him. It was no longer just the lost souls pleading for acknowledgement. Something darker lurked behind the veil, eager to claim another victim. With a deep breath, Nathan steeled himself against the rising tide of terror. "I won't let you take me," he shouted into the darkness, forcing the words through clenched teeth. He felt a flicker of strength, a determination to confront whatever malevolent force threatened to engulf him. The air grew colder, and the whispers transformed into an eerie cacophony, each voice layered with rage and sorrow. "Join us. Stay with us. There is no escape." The shadows twisted and writhed, revealing distorted figures that seemed to flicker between worlds, grotesque echoes of the souls he had just come to understand. As he glanced at the faces around him, those of the young woman, the businessman, the child, he felt an overwhelming sense of compassion surge through him. They were not just lost, they were trapped in a cycle of fear, unable to find peace. He realized that his empathy could be a weapon, a light piercing through the darkness that threatened to swallow him whole. "Listen," Nathan shouted, directing his words not just at the shadows, but at the lost souls gathered around him. "I know your pain, your regrets. You are not alone in this. You have stories worth telling, and you deserve to be remembered." The shadows hesitated, the chaotic whispers dwindling into an eerie silence. The lost souls turned their mournful gazes upon Nathan, their eyes shimmering with a faint glimmer of hope. For a moment, the oppressive darkness felt less suffocating, the air growing lighter as he began to weave their stories together. "We were here," he continued, his voice steady, anchoring him in the present. "You had lives, families, dreams. You deserve to be remembered, not forgotten. Together, we can break this cycle." As Nathan spoke, the figure in the tattered uniform stepped forward, nodding in agreement. "Yes, embrace them. They need your strength to confront the darkness that binds them." With renewed determination, Nathan focused on the faces surrounding him. "You are not just remnants of the past. You are part of a greater story. Let go of your fears, your regrets. Allow yourselves to be free." In that moment, the shadows began to recede, their grip loosening as the souls around him nodded slowly, their expressions shifting from sorrow to a flicker of understanding. Nathan reached out to the nearest soul, the young woman, and grasped her hand. Amrikrama. It felt cool, ethereal, yet he sensed a connection, a fragile thread binding their fates. "Together," he whispered, urging her to take a step toward the light, "we will find peace." As he and the young woman moved toward the center of the terminal, the whispers transformed into a soft murmur, a harmonious chorus of acknowledgement. The businessman stepped forward next, then the child with the teddy bear, joining Nathan and the young woman as they formed a circle. Each soul's presence strengthened the bond between them, creating a protective barrier against the encroaching darkness. But just as they began to feel a sense of unity, a chilling presence emerged from the depths of the shadows. It loomed large, a swirling mass of darkness with tendrils that reached out like ravenous claws. The air crackled with malice, and the shadows roared, drowning out the whispers of hope. "You cannot escape! You are mine!" Nathan felt his resolve shake under the weight of the entity's rage, but the warmth of the souls surrounding him steadied his heart. He turned to face the darkness, realizing he had a choice. "You have no power here," he shouted, his voice ringing with conviction. "We are not afraid of you." The dark mass writhed and convulsed, thrashing against their united front. But Nathan held firm, his voice rising above the chaos. "We will not be consumed by your despair. We are stronger together." With every word, the warmth of the souls intensified, radiating a light that pushed against the dark entity. The shadows screamed in fury, thrashing violently, but the combined strength of Nathan and the lost souls began to erode its grip on reality. They stood together, a beacon of light amidst the encroaching darkness. As the shadows recoiled, Nathan felt a surge of energy coursing through him, a primal force igniting his spirit. "Release them!" he cried out. And in that moment, the barrier of light expanded, illuminating the terminal with a radiant glow. The darkness howled, a cacophony of anguish as it began to dissipate, breaking apart like fragile glass. Nathan and the souls surged forward, the energy binding them, lifting their spirits, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as the light pushed back the shadows. In a final burst of determination, Nathan reached out, feeling the presence of each soul as they embraced the light. With a deafening roar, the dark entity shattered, scattering into the ether like ashes in the wind. Silence enveloped the terminal, a peaceful hush replacing the chaos. Nathan stood amidst the fading remnants of darkness, feeling the warmth of the souls beside him. They were free, finally liberated from the grasp of despair that had held them captive for so long. As the last echoes of their voices faded, Nathan felt a profound sense of relief wash over him. The shadows had receded, and the terminal felt lighter, as if it had shed the weight of its dark history. But even as the darkness diminished, a lingering unease filled the air, a reminder that the shadows still existed, waiting for the next traveler to face their own demons. As the last vestiges of darkness dissolved into the ether, Nathan found himself standing alone in the now eerily quiet terminal. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, replaced by a serene stillness that felt foreign after the chaos. Dim lights flickered overhead, and the gentle sound of rain outside provided a calming backdrop. He could hardly believe what had just transpired. The lost souls had finally found their peace, yet he felt a lingering weight within himself, a reminder of the shadows that still lurked in the corners of the airport. Glancing around, Nathan noticed the luggage that had once seemed abandoned and forlorn now appeared vibrant, almost alive. The suitcases were neatly arranged as if waiting to be claimed, their colors bright against the backdrop of the terminal. He could almost hear a whisper of gratitude emanating from them, a silent acknowledgement of the lives that had intersected in this place. However, despite the newfound calm, a sense of urgency gripped him. The storm outside continued to rage, and he could feel time slipping away, the clock ticking down towards midnight. What if he was still trapped here? What if the darkness returned? With determination coursing through his veins, he made his way toward the exit, keenly aware of the echoes of the past that still lingered in the air. As he approached the glass doors, he was taken aback by a sudden flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. He turned, heart pounding, and saw the figure in the tattered uniform standing a few feet away, his expression a mix of gratitude and sadness. "You did it," the figure said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of sorrow. "You freed them, but you must choose your own path now. The storm may be raging outside, but your journey isn't over." "What do you mean?" Nathan asked, feeling the weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. "I want to leave this place. I want to go home." The figure stepped closer, shadows dancing at the edges of his form. "To escape, you must confront your own darkness, the fears that have brought you here." His words echoed through Nathan's mind, and he felt a chill sweep through the terminal. The clock on the wall ticked ominously, each second a reminder that time was running out. "I don't understand," Nathan exclaimed, frustration and fear intertwining. "I faced the darkness. I helped them. Isn't that enough?" The figure shook his head slowly, a hint of sympathy in his gaze. "You've helped others find peace, but now you must find it for yourself. The storm reflects the turmoil within you. Only by confronting your fears can you truly escape this place." Nathan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Memories surged through him, regrets about his son, the moments of despair that had led him to this point, the overwhelming guilt that had shadowed him for so long. Could he confront those feelings? Could he finally accept the things he had been running from? He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the tide of emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "Okay," he said, voice trembling but resolute. "I will confront it. I won't let it control me anymore." As he spoke, the lights flickered violently again, and the atmosphere shifted. The terminal around him transformed, darkening as shadows pooled at his feet. A low growl resonated from the depths of the airport, a reminder of the darkness that still sought to consume him. Suddenly, the storm outside crashed violently against the windows, lightning illuminating the terminal in jagged flashes. Nathan felt a surge of energy course through him, igniting a primal urge to fight against the encroaching shadows. The whispers returned, low and insistent, tugging at his heart, each one a reflection of the fear he had buried deep inside. "I'm not afraid of you," Nathan shouted, feeling a fierce determination rise within him. "I choose to face you. I will not be defined by my fears." With each declaration, the shadows retreated slightly, the cacophony of whispers faltering as Nathan stepped forward, ready to confront the source of his turmoil. The air crackled with tension, the darkness swirling violently around him as he prepared to face the specters of his past. Before him stood a figure, a dark reflection of himself, a version twisted by despair, a haunting reminder of the pain he had endured. It wore a mask of sorrow, eyes filled with the weight of regret. "You can't escape from me," it hissed, voice dripping with contempt. "You are what you fear." But Nathan stood firm, grounding himself in the understanding he had gained from the souls he had freed. "No, I am not my fear. I am stronger. I'm stronger, baby. This. With each word, he felt the shackles of guilt begin to break, the chains of regret shattering into 1,000 pieces. As he faced the figure, Nathan felt a warmth blossoming within him, a light that surged forth, illuminating the darkness surrounding him. "I will remember them. I will honor their stories, but I will not be consumed by my past." With that declaration, a brilliant light erupted from Nathan, enveloping the figure in darkness. The storm outside roared in response, but he could feel the power of his own resolve pushing back against the shadows. The dark reflection writhed, its form disintegrating as the light surged, banishing the darkness from the terminal. The air grew still, the echoes of the storm fading as Nathan emerged from the confrontation, breathing heavily but filled with a profound sense of release. He had faced his fears and found strength in the memories of those he had lost. intertwining their stories with his own. As the last remnants of darkness vanished, Nathan turned back to the glass doors of the terminal, now shimmering with a welcoming light. The figure in the tattered uniform smiled softly, a hint of approval in his gaze. "You've done it, Nathan. You've found your way back." With one last look back at the terminal, a place filled with the memories of lost souls and the shadows of his own fears, Nathan stepped through the doors. The storm outside had calmed, the sky clearing as dawn broke over the horizon. In that moment, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He was free. The journey had changed him, and he carried the stories of the lost with him as he stepped into the new day, ready to embrace the life that awaited him. And so Nathan's adventure came to a close, a tale woven through the threads of fear, loss, and ultimately, redemption. He learned that confronting darkness, both within and around him, was the key to breaking free. And with that knowledge, he stepped forward into the light, leaving the shadows behind.